All right, there we go. Okay, I'm gonna give a couple people just a few more minutes to come in. All right, so I'm gonna give people just a couple more minutes to come in. And I'm going to go over a few more things about my process and the different materials that I use. And if at any point in time you have any questions, please feel free to add it into the chat box or send me a message. You can also comment on some of the posts that I've done today. And I also want to take a minute to thank the Wiregrass Museum for allowing me to do this artist takeover and share a little bit about my work and give some insights onto the different processes and materials that I use. In case you weren't able to see my last live video, I'll kind of do a short recap. I basically went over some of the products that I use. I specifically use the Smooth On brand, which is this guy right here. I like that company a lot because of their diverse material offerings. They have products that, as long as you choose one within the same line, they're all compatible with each other, so I don't have to worry about having any issues with carrying or any separation issues. One thing I did not mention is that the silicone, or why I use the silicone. You do have options to use silicone or urethane. These molds here are actually a urethane rubber. You get very similar results, but with my work, I'm specifically dealing with issues of health and disease. And for me, a way to combine my work with the medical field is to use silicone. And this Sort of Clear silicone, the type Sort of Clear 18, is a brand of silicone that is food safe and it is skin safe. And so it's a very high grade type of silicone. And I find that it's very rugged. I typically only use urethane rubbers, like these guys, for making molds, which is what this is. One important thing that I mentioned in my last video was compatibility for curing. So silicone and urethane do not like each other. I think that, and don't hold me to this, but I think that urethane will set up in a silicone mold, but I can assure you that silicone will not set up into a urethane mold. Okay, you'll end up with this globby mess and it just won't work right. Silicone will set up in a silicone mold, and I typically use urethane in a urethane mold. It just works out better that way. The other thing with silicone is that it can be finicky with plasticine. So you'll notice that this is a 2-part mold. Let me move these guys. This is a 2-part mold. And so I used an object, and this is actually the piece that this came from. So I took a mold from it. I actually use plasticine in order to layer up and make my part line. Certain plasticines, I believe it's sulfur that you have the problem with, but double check on that. The Smooth On website has all the information and tells you what it's not, but I believe it's sulfur. But certain brands of plasticine will not allow the silicone to cure fully. And again, you'll end up with this globby mess. But I use this mold particularly to make waxes so that I can cast glass pieces. And so urethane works really well. Silicone, I find, is just a little bit stronger. And from molds, I tend to be able to get more pulls from a silicone mold. But again, a lot of the reason I use silicone is more for its connection to the medical industry. And since my work is trying to have conversations about health and disease, I find that connection very important. So that's a little bit about urethane molds, why I use silicone, and then here's a little bit more about my products, again, that I like to use. They're all within the Smooth On universe. The Psycho paint is really great. I know I mentioned that in my last video as well, but I have an example here. So the Psycho paint can be used in combination with your pigments. So pigments can work with Psycho paint, or they can also be added to the Sorta Clear to get kind of a translucent color, which is how I get that yellow in my honeycomb pattern. This one though, I did use the pigments in the actual surface, which is why I had this lighter blue, but it came out a little lighter than what I would want. So I used my Psycho paint with my pigments in order to airbrush this kind of gradient that goes along with it. And with the Psycho paint, like I had mentioned earlier, it's very important to use that versus like an acrylic or something else, because the Psycho paint will bend and flex with the surface. So let me see if I can get this to focus a little bit more. Hang on. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. But you'll notice that as I begin to bend and stretch my silicone, the paint, even though it's sitting on the top surface, bends with it. Anytime you use acrylic or a harder paint, even though it may be, or a latex paint, even though it's a flexible paint, it will not adhere to the surface and it'll begin to start peeling and chipping away. So those are two different methods. It's also a great way for me to patch any areas or to create a transition if some of my tints are slightly off between one plate to another. This is also a great example of, if you've been following along with my stories, you'll notice that I talked a little bit about using stitching. So that is the stitching there, and I use that for all of my edges to combine them, and that's just embroidery thread. I do use glue a little bit if I want seamless areas, but I like incorporating the stitching, especially into my biomimetic series, since they are very realistic to organs and definitely speak to organ transplantation. I like using the 3D printed portions in combination with some handmade elements that kind of gives a nod to the need for that human touch. Just like a surgeon, you need that human, or even someone to program the 3D printer to come up with the ideas of creating 3D printed organs. That series, if you take a look back at my feed, I give a little bit more insight as to where that came from, some personal history, but also how I very much see this work coming in during the COVID pandemic. I think it's having a very relevant conversation. But again, I did post earlier some images, but it actually, the honeycomb, just for an example, since we're live here, I do a 3D printed, I come up with a pattern in Rhino, I 3D print it in plastic. This is one of my molds, so that I can then take my silicone plates, I think, an example. So this one's in a bag. I keep things in bags because the silicone dust and dirt likes to stick to the surface a lot, so keeping it in the Ziploc bags just keeps it very clean. But that's what it looks like to begin with. So it's just a plate, and then I bend and stretch. So if I were to snip all of the stitching away from this, it'll lay flat once again. So that's a little bit about some of the paint and how to apply. I also mentioned that silicone will not stick to a lot of surfaces, except for itself. It's really good sticking to itself, in which case please use mold release always. I like the spray mold release. I think that it keeps from removing a lot of your detail, but also I've had some problems with Vaseline and silicone, making it not necessarily not cure, but taking a little bit longer. I'm not sure why, but that tends to sometimes be a problem. So I incorporate a lot of mixed media work, and this is a wood turn form that I made, and I coated it in a sealer on the outside, so that it has this nice smooth exterior. And with that, you can actually, set that up like that, you can actually either drip the silicone over top to create this nice, beautiful layers, or you can airbrush the silicone. And again, I would use the silicone solvent that you see here to thin that out. And if you'd like some more information, please contact me and I'd be happy to talk with you about it. But the dripping is how I get these kind of wonderful effects like this. And then once I peel, as you can see, I basically spread this over the exterior so that there's kind of a, sorry, I'm doing this one-handed, but it pulled from the exterior surface and retained the shape of my exterior kind of cup-like form. So when I pulled it away, it retains that shape, and then no matter how much I can take this, and it'll always go back to its original shape. This is really great material to do with shipping, especially if you've ever worked with glass or ceramics. Being able to ship something that is not fragile is wonderful. That's not purely why I use it, but it does make me really happy inside. Alright, so this next piece is actually one that you'll see in my next Instagram post. I'm going to give a little bit more insight to. But as you can see, wood components, glass components, and there's actually silicone components within this as well. So I like to do a lot of mixed media work, and I particularly love wood turning. So this piece was actually multi-axis wood turned, so it's completely done on the lathe. You can check out my Instagram, Katie_May_Adams, and I have kind of a step-by-step showing you how I made this kind of organic form. So I use that to create my two-part mold, and then I'm able to cast wax into the two-part mold and make glass components. This form is obviously not wood, but originally when I first wood turned it, it was wood. So I made a wood version that looked just like this, made a mold just like I did with this one, and made it into wax and then cast it into glass. And this is a kiln casting process, not blowing. But the other reason that I like using silicone is because, believe it or not, this top portion is silicone here. So you can see it moving and bending. Silicone works really great with glass. You can see that there's a pretty seamless transition between the glass and the silicone. And so I find it a great way to combine or give a little bit more of an organic feel to cast objects. For me, I love casting, but I find that the end product tends to be a little stagnant, I guess, because it's the same form that I've just repeated and repeated it. And I don't like that idea of copy. So I like being able to add these kind of organic elements to these pieces to make them one of a kind, even if they are originally, like this one does look like another and another. They all have their own slight unique properties, so you can see there. And then I did use the silicone glue to adhere this to the surface. It will peel off if I try really hard, so this does have to be treated pretty delicately, but if you feel through here, it doesn't budge. It's pretty well connected to the surface. And the silicone glue that I do use is a smooth-on product. It's very specific for silicones. And that I also use to make my plates larger if I need to for that biomimetic series, in case you have been following along with my Instagram takeover. So that's a little bit about my process. Like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. You can comment on any of my posts because I'm going to be finishing out the takeover the rest of this evening, or you can contact me through my website or my Instagram account, and I would love to talk with you about materials if you have questions. I can also send you some links to a few things. Smooth On has some great videos. If you want to take a look at those, that would be wonderful. But I love answering questions about products, materials, and everything else. But thank you all for joining in with me and through these last two videos. And please follow along with the rest of my story for the rest of the day for my artist takeover. And I would like to say thank you so much to the Wiregrass Museum again for giving me this opportunity to share with you all a little bit about my process and what I do, and giving some insight into my work and what it really means to me. So thank you, Wiregrass, and also thank you for being able to put on a wonderful show. The B20 exhibition, which one of my pieces is included in, was supposed to be in person, but that's when the COVID pandemic hit, and so they did a wonderful job of creating an online version of the exhibition. So you should all check it out if you get the chance. So thank you guys, and have a good evening.